In last week's video, I spoke about Tywin Lannister. Yep, I do know he's pronounced this way, I just tend to forget it all the time. Even if you haven't seen the video, chances are you already know Tywin, as he is one of the main antagonists of HBO's hit series Game of Thrones for several seasons. Last time, we spoke about him being a ruthless but effective leader, a strategic mastermind and a man who basically thinks about nothing but how he can achieve his overarching goal. But you might say, if he is such an amazing leader, then why isn't he the one who's sitting on the Iron Throne at the end of the series? Well, my friends, that's precisely what we're going to focus on today. And with that, hi folks, my name's LJ and I'm that leadership guy. On this channel, I look at fictional leaders from TV, movies and games, mainly because I think it's a lot of fun, but there are actually always a few things to be learned along the way. Such as in today's case, why all the money, effectiveness and ruthless pragmatism in the world can't help you if you fall victim to one of the most common pitfalls for any leader who has ever lived. Today, we will talk about a phenomenon which is so incredibly widespread in the business world that it's unbelievable how any modern leader can still fall for it. But if you happen to be by any chance one of those bosses who commit the leadership sin we are talking about in this video, don't be too hard on yourself, you're in the very best company. As I mentioned last time, Tywin Lannister is in many aspects a picture-perfect leader. His ability to think strategically is almost unrivaled in the Kingdom of Westeros, allowing him not only to be prepared for developments no one else might ever see coming, but also to immediately adapt his plans to any situation that might arise unexpectedly. Whilst many might think that it's Tywin's inexhaustible financial resources his enemies should fear most, more prudent men such as Ned Stark know that his real strengths are his mastery of contingency planning, his willingness to join forces with basically anyone who might serve his cause, and his ruthlessness, which allows him to take steps others would not even dare to dream of. When I talked about Tywin Lannister in my last video, I mentioned his focus on the bigger picture or his ultimate goal several times, without actually specifying what exactly this overarching goal was. Funnily enough, it's in the very first scene in which we ever encounter this man, where he clearly states what drives any of his actions.
Your mother's dead. Before long I'll be dead. And you. And your brother, and your sister, and all of her children. All of us dead, all of us rotting in the ground. It's the family name that lives on. It's all that lives on. Not your personal glory, not your honor, but family. The future of our family will be determined in these next few months. We could establish a dynasty that will last 1,000 years. Or we could collapse into nothing.
You might remember from last week that Tywin mentioned earlier in the meeting how the lion should never concern himself with the opinions of the sheep. Now here we have him putting the family name above anything else, in what seems to be a contradiction to this earlier lion and the sheep statement. This overarching goal to me always seemed kind of, well, odd, as legacy typically is a rather ideological goal that to me does not quite seem to fit to Tywin's otherwise pragmatic, unemotional mindset. I'm no psychologist, so I can't really talk about whether this might have been a slight oversight maybe by George R.R. Martin himself in Tywin's characterization, or whether it's just a valid flaw in the character himself. Anyways, it doesn't really matter in light of Tywin's fatal mistake, which in the end is responsible for his complete failure. Think about it for a second. Where do you think Tywin goes wrong? When he fails to get rid of all of the Starks in season 3? or when he doesn't put enough emphasis on the efforts to assassinate Daenerys Targaryen, underestimating the danger she and her dragons might pose to the kingdom, or when he doesn't recognize the youngest daughter of his former lethal enemy when she stands right in front of him. Actually, I think none of the things I just mentioned really mattered in the bigger scheme of things. The one thing Tywin really got wrong, in my opinion, was far more essential and much closer to home. What if I told you that Tywin should never have married his daughter to Loras Tyrell? That he should have taken the incestuous relationship between his oldest children way more seriously, and that more than anything else perhaps, he should have looked beyond the facade of his wine and whore-loving son Tyrion, recognizing his very own strategic mastermind in his youngest heir. Not that any of these situations would have mattered on its own, but they all point to a bigger flaw in Tywin's thinking, and one that was absolutely critical. Tywin simply assumed that all of his family members shared the exact same goal.
We could establish a dynasty that will last 1,000 years.
At that point, let's take a quick look at Tywin's offspring. Cersei's worldview seems to be the one most in line with her father's, as she certainly cares for power and the legacy of House Lannister. However, above all, Cersei is protective of her 3 children, who are more important to her than anyone else in the world. Maybe apart from herself and her own ambitions, that is. Jaime, in turn, is deeply in love with his twin sister, so anything he cares about is finding new ways to be close to Cersei and to protect her from any harm. It's quite obvious that the kind of reputation that would emerge from this relationship is not at all what Tywin has in mind for House Lannister's 1,000-year legacy. Lastly, we have Tyrion. One of the most complex and morally grounded characters of the series, he certainly matches his father in cleverness and the ability to see the bigger picture. However, Tyrion lived as an outcast for much of his life, thus having developed a deep sense of justice and empathy that most of his fellow family members, including Tywin, lacked. His focus is not on legacy, and certainly not the one of House Lannister, mind you, but rather on the greater good, improving the world he and everybody else lives in. To sum it up, none of his children really share Tywin's great goal of building an everlasting legacy of House Lannister, and yet he constantly seems to assume that his stance somehow is the party line everyone around him strictly adheres to. Even when he sentences his own son to death, completely breaking with him and blaming Tyrion for basically anything that has ever gone wrong with the family, Tywin still seems to somehow assume Tyrion would be just fine with it, accepting his own death as a way to play his part in the creation of the Lannisters' legacy, which obviously is completely absurd. Assuming that children, subordinates, team members, or whoever just share the goals of their parents, bosses, or coaches is such an obviously faulty reasoning that it is stunning how many leaders are still deceived by it to this day. Let's just take a little detour here, looking at an anecdote from the early days of the Roman Empire. I don't know whether it's really true, but I like it so much that I hope it actually took place. According to the anecdote, Emperor Caligula once entered a galley and had the captain set course for Britain, determined to conquer the whole island just because he could. The ship set sails and left the harbor, only to immediately turn around and set anchor again when Caligula noticed no other ships were following him. True or not, this little story provides us with a perfect example of a leader who just assumes everyone would be sharing his goals. But we don't have to look back to the Roman times to find other examples of this kind of bias. Think of the employer who is completely blindsided by one of the top employees suddenly quitting out of the blue, leaving his or her boss entirely dumbfounded. In these situations, we often hear phrases such as, "I really don't know what got into him," with bosses typically looking for mistakes only on the employee's part. And if you then ask the one who quit, he might say something like, well, everybody knew the workload was killing me, or I just like to spend more time with my family. I don't care for my career that much. In short, leaders should never, and I mean never, assume that their own and their followers' goals are perfectly aligned. Of course, there are lots of cases where this might be a correct assumption, but more often it's way safer to assume that it's not even close. If you ever find yourself thinking about someone, what a great guy, he just lives for the company, chances are you either have found a 1 in a million employee or you are up for a rather unpleasant surprise sometime in the future. By the way, this is something you find on all hierarchical levels, from the factory workers to department heads, vice presidents, or anybody who's not the owner of the company. People always have their own agenda, and it's hardly ever perfectly aligned with the company's goals. As a leader, you might try to find out what motivates your employees deep down inside, but you should never be too sure that you know what really drives them. Naturally, this type of faulty thinking is most prevalent in entrepreneurs and founders, as they are basically the ones who set the company goals in the first place. Also, there are lots of stories from family businesses that just, faded away because the owner's children didn't care in the least about the career paths their parents had envisioned for them. Which somehow leads us right back to Tywin Lannister and his fatal mistake. Thinking that his children all share his goals to a T, Tywin assumes that they will certainly be fine with whatever role he has assigned to them in his bigger plans. He is so sure that Cersei will have no problem with marrying Loras Tyrell as it serves the bigger goal, or Tyrion with being made the scapegoat for anything that goes wrong in the kingdom, that it just doesn't even occur to him his children might revolt against any of his plans. Not even when Tywin kills Tyrion's big love and mocks him for his feelings afterwards. In the end, it seems almost tragic, or depending on your sense of humor, ironic, that a man who was always planning for any contingency and who cared about nothing more than about his family's legacy is shot by his own son while sitting on the toilet, just because he failed to understand the human nature of his own children. Well, this is it. A simple but fatal mistake that could literally happen to any modern leader as well. What can we do to avoid it, you might ask? This is not an easy question to answer, but I will try to do so whilst I sum up what we just learned today. To me, the problem is that there is no real way to find out to what precise extent a follower's goals are aligned with the ones of his or her leader, the company, the family, or whomever. But I think it's important to acknowledge that all followers are individuals, human beings with their very own personal history and worldview, as well as a complex set of motives that drives their behavior. Leaders should never assume they know everything about their followers, and if possible, they should not base long-term plans on individual people within their team, but rather think of a specific type of person they need to achieve their goals. I'm pretty sure Tywin Lannister might have been way more successful if he had adhered to these simple rules of thumb instead of blindly assuming something he could not possibly verify. However, he will certainly not be the last leader we look at on this channel who failed because he was making wrong assumptions about his followers. For now, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if so, please don't forget to leave a like or subscription so you don't miss out on future videos on fictional leaders such as Albus Dumbledore, Christian Avasarala or Vito Corleone. Until then, see you next time and be good people.